Alright, welcome. Today we are going to use this wheel to kind of review the different ways that we can convert between rational number forms. So the three forms that we're focusing on today are decimals, percents, and fractions. If you could start by turning your wheel and finding the section that says decimal to fraction. That's going to be the first area that we're going to focus on. When we are doing a decimal to a fraction, the main thing I want you to focus or think about is using the place value, as we talked about earlier this year, of our decimals. So for example, in this number, we have 6 hundredths. So we would look at this being 6 over 100. And then we always want to make sure we simplify when we can. Since 6 and 100 are both divisible by 2, I'm going to go ahead and divide each of these by 2, and this would end up being 3/50ths as our final answer. Alright, so the next one's 48 hundredths. That's going to be a similar type of thing. I'm going to jump down to the bottom one. So here we have 125 thousandths. So this becomes 125 over 1,000. One thing you can think about is, like, for example, 6 hundredths has 2 digits behind the decimal, and then there's 2 digits in 100. 125 thousandths has 3 digits behind the decimal point. So it ends up being 3 zeros in our denominator. Once again, I'm going to simplify. Both of these are divisible by 25. And if you didn't know 25, you can use smaller numbers too. 125 divided by 25 ends up equaling 5. And then 1,000 divided by 25 ends up equaling 40. And those can go even further because both of these are divisible by 5. So in the end, we end up with an answer of 1/8. So decimals to fractions, we want to focus on place value or kind of counting how many digits are behind that decimal point and then going from there. If you want to pause the video and try the 48 hundredths on your own, we can go from, and then you can check it. So if you did 48 over 100, that would be what we would use to start. Both of these are divisible by 4. 48 divided by 4 is 12. 100 divided by 4 is 25. And that one cannot be simplified any further. All right, moving on. Now we're going fractions to decimals. The key with fractions to decimals is dividing that numerator by the denominator. And I would just use a calculator for this. So 7/8, we would just take 7 divided by 8, and that ends up equaling 0.875. 4/5, same type of thing. I'm going to do 4 divided by 5, and we end up with 0.8. So fractions to decimals, pretty straightforward, just numerator divided by denominator. Now we're going to start looking at how do we change a decimal to a percent. So a decimal to a percent is really just taking that decimal and multiplying it by 100. Because as we've talked about in class, percents are always per 100. So we're really looking at what is this decimal out of 100. So I'm going to take 48 hundredths and multiply it by 100. You could use a calculator. And this ends up being 48%. Same thing here. 8/100 times 100. This ends up being 8%. 2 56/100 times 100 ends up being 256%. One thing when you're changing to a decimal percent, anytime that you're multiplying by 100, we talked about this earlier this year, what you're doing, because there's those 2 zeros behind 100, our place value changes by 2. So in each one of these, we're changing our decimal point by 2 spots. So for an additional example, if you had 9/10 and then we multiplied that by 100, or took that decimal point over and moved it to 2 spots, see how there's that blank space there? That actually is going to become 90%. Or you might have a situation where you have something like 0.087 or 87 thousandths. This one, when we multiply by 100 and the decimal point moves over those 2 spots, ends up being just 8.7%. So you really have to be careful. A lot of times I'll see students just pull the decimal point out and just write the number as it is, but really we're just moving the decimal point over those 2 spots because we're multiplying by 100. All right, now if changing a decimal to a percent is multiplying by 100, then it would make sense that when we're changing a percent to a decimal, we want to divide by 100. So we're undoing what we just did. 97% divide by 100, or we're going to take the decimal point that's not actually there and move it back 2 spots. So this becomes 97/100. Same thing here, I'm going to take this and move it back 2 spots, but we have that blank space there. So this becomes 9/100. And when we do 125, the decimal point's at the end, move it back 2 spots, this becomes 1.25 or 1 25/100. All right, what if we want to change a fraction to a percent? There are different ways that we can do this. So one thing we could think about doing is changing the denominator to 100. If you change the denominator to 100, then whatever is in the numerator becomes your percent. For example, 3/4 is pretty easy to do that with because 4 goes into 100 25 times, like 4 quarters. So then I would just do the same thing to the top. So 3 times 25 is 75, 4 times 25 is 100. Now since we have 100 in the denominator, the numerator is our percent. 2/5 also can multiply into 100 really easily. 5 times 20 is 100. So we would do 2 times 20, which is 40, and then that would become 40%. Unfortunately though, as we know, not all fractions turn into nice percentages or even multiply into 100 evenly. What if you had a fraction like 2/3? Well, I can't multiply anything by 3 to make 100. So when that happens, what we want to do, or you can do this all the time if you want to, is we can change it to a decimal first by taking the numerator divided by the denominator and then multiplying that by 100. So it's basically like taking a couple different steps. So here I would take 2 divided by 3, which gives us 0.6666666 forever because it's 0.6 repeating. And then I would take that and multiply it by 100, giving us a percentage of about 66.6% or about 67%, depending on what you were looking for. All right, last one, we want to change our percent to a fraction. Remember that percent, right? Cent means out of 100. So percents are always out of 100. Meaning we can just take each one of those percents and put it over 100. So this becomes 9 over 100. 97 becomes 97 over 100. And then 125 becomes 125 over 100. And just like before, you want to simplify if you can. 9 out of 100 cannot be, neither can 97. 125 over 100 could be. This would actually become 1 and 25 over 100, which would then become 1 and 1/4. But any of those would technically be acceptable answers for 125% as a fraction. All right, so that is how we change rational numbers between forms. If you want, you can kind of check some of the different ones around the outside. Otherwise, you should grab a practice page and work on that.